machine would.
Good morning. This is Adam Sturch podcasting from the Mushroom Ancient House in Mexico, working on oil painting, conscientious emergence. Alright, picking up from where we left off last time from the whales, now I'm going to take a very semi-opaque, semi-translucent glaze and just kind of give her a little bit more glow around the highlight edges before I start detailing the spots and dots and little wiggles that will compose her coralish sort of figure. So yeah, a pretty easy step today, but necessary for the next.
A soulless cuckoo clock of natural laws. What you're inside is an organism. And since you are an organism, there is suddenly an enormous dimension for empathy. You can understand then, I feel, I strive, I know hope and disappointment, and I can therefore transfer these qualities to the dynamic of the world around me. And this is very important. Again, recall that what we're talking about is why one paradigm replaces another. This is very important for us as a species to get in contact with what we've done to the planet. If the planet is a thing, you can basically use it. If it's an organism, then you must relate to it the way you would relate, to another person, or at least to a fine animal or something like that.
Can I ask a question? How would you suggest I would go from a law, looking through the paradigm of law into the paradigm of habit, and how I'm seeing and experiencing the world? What would you suggest in my perceptual approach to the world around me?
Okay, well, that's next. And this is probably the most controversial part of all this. It was very important when this when this freedom and law dichotomy was set up. Every paradigm has a hidden or secret agenda. And what lies behind this freedom and law thing is Christian ethics. It's very important in Christian ethics, other than some fairly minor and screwball variants, to maintain the idea of human freedom. Because man cannot fall and be redeemed without the dimension of human freedom. And the dimension of human freedom is a precondition for guilt. Only the free can be guilty, because only the free are responsible for what they do. After all, if the universe is a determinism, then you do what you do because you couldn't do anything else. And so to expect you to take responsibility for that is a little weird. So it was very important to establish the idea of human freedom, and all our political systems are built on various adumbrations of this concept of freedom. Habit and novelty is a shift slightly east on this issue. There's a lot less freedom in the habit and novelty equation, and there's a lot less responsibility. And responsibility, Wi Po Yang, the 9th century Chinese alchemist, said worry is preposterous. Worry is preposterous. And then the exegesis explains that in order to worry, you have to know what's going on. If you don't know what's going on, worry is an absurd. It's like someone who knows nothing about automobiles worrying that their car may break down. It's immaterial. So freedom is a very touchy subject, and I offer this in an exploratory manner. And there are very respectable orthodox positions which would tell you that the creation of the ideal of human freedom and the way in which it has been enshrined and defended in Western political institutions is the crowning achievement of the civilization. The problem is, it has a curious relationship to two other important power concentrations, the community and the ego. Where does freedom lie in that spectrum? When we say, if you are a Jeffersonian Democrat, a materialist, a paid-up member of the Democratic Party, and you say you are free, do you mean you are free to do whatever you want to do? Or do you mean you are free to participate in the general will of the community? This is not a closed issue. Over the centuries, the answer to that question has shifted. The 19th century, in America, based on the exposure to frontier hardship and that sort of thing, was much more about the freedom of the community to do what it wanted to do. In the 20th century, consumerism and the disappearing of frontiers and the rise of populations and the packing of populations very tightly freedom has tended to mean the right to gratify the whims of the ego. And this has led to a whole bunch of anti-communal attitudes and phenomena. Class struggle, consumerism, manufacture of useless and soon-to-be obsolete objects, people trapped in a rat race of media-propagated needs and low salary and, the rat race. So, the thing from the very beginning that has always puzzled me when people talk about the future was there's a general agreement that it's going to be more collective. That, we talk in terms of the internet, we talk in terms of boundary dissolution, community, and yet the great metaphor for collectivism is now in ruins. Marxism, it's finished. And so there is no countervailing force to this freedom and law image at the moment. But I think that when community coalesces around the felt need to express community values, then the paradigm shift will be very close to happening. Now, when will that happen? Things will have to get a lot worse. Because you see, the paradox is that the people who can change the world, people like you and me, the upper 5% of the literate elites of the industrial democracies, we're the furthest away from the bad news. We're getting 3 squares and having a fine time. So somehow there has to be a sense of danger or impending chaos. And then we will, I hope, organize ourselves to get out of it.
So you're saying the organism is reaching a point of transformation that will be very painful for many and not so painful for few, or painful for all?
Well, I guess that leads to the subject of change. Change is in and of itself neither painful nor pleasurable. But, the Bob Dylan song that says, when you got nothing to lose. Well, a lot of people have nothing, and a few people have something. And I think it wouldn't hurt for everybody to lighten their ballast a little bit to float higher. So these ideas have a lot of implications. A paradigm touches everything, and it begins very deeply. But I think that my, fractal mathematics, chaos theory, complexity theory, my own stuff with the time wave, all of this is going to, in a sense, erase much of the mystery about the future. That the future is in a freedom and law system necessarily unknowable. Because if you knew the future, then this idea of freedom would fall under a shadow. But if you replace freedom with the idea of novelty, and see then that no matter how unique a situation is, it was somehow preceded, announced, anticipated by earlier situations, then the anxiety that is built in to the freedom and law formulation disappears. Because you see, with the acceptance of this idea of freedom comes the acceptance of an unknown future, when in fact a great deal of the future can be triangulated and known even with old-style mathematical and cognitive techniques. And when you toss in the new stuff, then we indeed have headlights on our vehicles, and it does throw a high beam into the future. So, well, novelty replaces freedom in that freedom is this idea that anything is possible and that you create it. And novelty is the idea that sometimes interesting things are possible and you are more like the gifted recipient. You know, it embeds you more. Freedom is an fairly alienating concept. This is what modern existentialism understood. You know, that woman, can't remember her name, Margaret Greene, who wrote that book, Dreadful Freedom, talks about how, you know, once you embrace freedom, a great deal of supportive structure fell away, which the existentialists embraced as a necessary confrontation with man's situation in the cosmos. But I think they were pessimistic. Sartre's ultimate formulation of all this was, he said, nature is mute. Well, nature is not mute. That's ridiculous. How could somebody get so tweaked around as to hold that position? I don't believe it. Nature is not mute. Nature is the available statement for deconstruction on the nature of being. I mean, if you don't believe that, then you're an existentialist and you believe that human freedom is the proper domain of becoming. But this has not led to very happy. I mean, I see that as a prologue to some kind of fascism. You know, the Nietzschean super will is in there someplace. But I think native peoples, aboriginals, if you could explain these two things, freedom and law, they're not going to get freedom and law. An Amazon tribe wouldn't have a clue. But if you talk about novelty and habit, this they understand. This is what life is to anybody who's paying attention. While freedom and law both are high-flown abstractions that come out of a very special philosophical agenda that by the time Hume and Locke and John Stuart Mill got to it, it was 2,000 years old.
But most of the time, novelty is a word, and habit as a word is a put-off. I mean, to think about this, you know, I think in our culture, for me, has always been something that I've moved away from.
You mean that novelty sounds trivial?
Novelty has seemed superficial, and habit has seemed something that I have no control over. It's something that I do over and over and over and over and over again.
Well, in a sense, yeah.
So it's interesting that you're using and law and freedom in my life.
Well, everybody who ever had a civics class, law and freedom.
Right. So it's interesting to.
Well, I should explain, because since you bring it up, it may be in other people's minds. The reason I use the word novelty is because I'm a great fan of Alfred North Whitehead, who was probably the last and greatest of the Platonists. And he has a theory which is put forth in Process and Reality, which is his life's work, magnum opus, in which novelty is the word he wants to use, because he says, there is out of the background of what has been emerges the unique. And he, as I felt that what we call nature is a habit, a novelty-conserving engine, that what nature glories in is novelty. You know, the pattern on the butterfly's wing, the color of the polyp, the molecular species of the synapse, the chemical dynamics at the heart of a star, that somehow nature is, originally I called the counterpoise of novelty, logically I think, entropy, which is a familiar concept in physics, well understood mathematically. But Rupert convinced me that habit was a much more applicable idea. And novelty is easy to understand but hard to define. It's like the word complexity, another word very easy to understand, very hard to define. I mean, whole conferences are held on what is complexity, and people leave in fury, not speaking to each other. But intuitively, we grasp what this means. Sometimes for novelty, I've used the phrase density of connection, because I think that, you know, like the arborization of the nervous system in the human brain or in the vascular system of a plant, that as many points as can be made cotangential to each other defines the complexity of a system. But it's basically and ultimately an intuitive and poetic concept, which is probably as it should be.
The novelty of nature is embedded in the habit of nature.
Nature is almost all habit and a tiny, tiny cutting edge of novelty. That's right.
I relate that to the, at the subatomic particle level. In fact, that's complete novelty. Anything can happen except it is constrained by 12 habits, the symmetry principles.
Yes, although I don't know if I want to get off into this, but since you're here, Paul, it's a good time. Are you following all this stuff about how uncertainty is really taking a beating, and people are saying that it isn't this mysterious property of nature, it's a mysterious property of Swedish quantum physicists, and that the David Bohm's formulation of the quanta is a much more elegant formulation and eliminates the uncertainty domain at the cost of introducing non-locality, which, because of Bell's theorem, they're practically ready to admit. So there is this sort of wild horse movement in quantum physics to make it completely explicit and predictable, and to get rid of all the woo-woo that comes in with the Niels Bohr formulation.
I wasn't thinking so much of the uncertainty principle, but for example, time can reverse. There's nothing at the subatomic particle level that constrains time one way or the other, as far as I know. And so lots of things can happen, and yet there are certain habits that involve in the universe, which we call laws of physics, or actually the symmetry principles.
Right.
And it seems to me that it would have to be that way. If that's what's happening at the nature level, it's reflecting something that's happening at a deeper.
Well, you came in late, but part of what we were talking about was Prigozhin and some of his new work, and one of the things he casts doubt on, or is very skeptical of, is the irreversibility principle. He says, first of all, he says time is a process, it's not a concept, and that there is an arrow, which is good news for my position, because I've always felt that there was an arrow.
Is there order and disorder? And I'm hearing you say order, I'm hearing you say disorder. Is there an order to the chaos, and not to create it as predictable?
Chaos is the mother of order.
So it is a system, then. It is, in a sense, its own law.
Well, yeah, one of the things that I have down here to cover, but we haven't sort of steered near it, but that does it, is if we go, I mean, for a scientist, here's the real difference between what freedom and law means and what novelty and habit means. The way science has been done since Newton is through probability theory. You get this with Cantor and these people. Probability theory is a very, very necessary tool for science, but it may be a bogus assumption about nature. Let's think about probability theory for a moment. Here's how it works. You want to know how much electricity is flowing through a wire. You carry out 1,000 measurements. You add them together. You divide by 1,000. You now say, this is how much electricity is flowing through the line. Well, but it's entirely possible that if you look back through the 1,000 measurements you made, not one will be the same as this average value, which you're now holding up and saying is how much electricity is flowing through the line. Not one of your measurements confirms your final conclusion. But people say, well, but, induction and accumulation of sample and averaging. Averaging is what's going on here at the center. And the key to using averaging with intellectual effectiveness is you're making an assumption that's very deep. And the assumption you're making is that time is invariant. Well, that is simply an assumption. It is the centrally untested assumption of science over the past 500 years. Now, let's take something really important.
You say that this is the amount of electricity that's flowing through this particular point.
Well, but the whole notion of science is not that we attain states of consensus, but that we
So I went ahead and gave a little more glow to the sun and a little detail to the glowing clouds that are kind of washing down into the ocean realm. There we go. Zoom in on that a little bit. Still a long way to go, but that sets the stage for some cloud detail and gets that sun glowing, and that will all be watery, that will be shining through, but that will take some time to render. And so one step at a time. Right now that gives her a little more glow along the edges and sets up a higher contrast for the shadows. And next step will be to bring out the little shapes. I'm going to take some very light purple, some very light blues, and an array of light, cool colors, and start, there will be sort of like accentuating these patterns, smaller patterns within them. About the easiest way I can describe that. A little bit like Samsara, a large painting I did a number of years ago. But that's it for the moment. Thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion House in Mexico, working on oil painting conscientious emergence. Have a good afternoon, Earth.